If you served in Vietnam, you know the enemy wasn't just the Vietcong. The jungle itself was filled with creatures that made every moment miserable. Things that crawled on you while you slept, swarmed you during the day, bit you constantly, and never gave you a moment's peace. These weren't necessarily the deadliest threats. They were the ones that destroyed morale, made sleep impossible, contaminated food, spread disease, and turned everyday existence into constant torment. Based on military records, medical reports, and countless veteran accounts, these are the creatures that made soldiers absolutely miserable. Vietnam's rats were everywhere. In base camps, bunkers, firebase positions, anywhere Americans set up operations. They weren't small mice. These were large, aggressive rodents that seemed to have no fear of humans. The rats came for the food. American positions had sea rations, supply dumps, mess halls, a buffet for rodent populations. They'd chew through boxes, bags, and containers to get at food. Soldiers would wake up to find rats had eaten through their packs and destroyed their rations. But food theft was just the beginning. The rats would crawl over sleeping soldiers at night. Multiple accounts describe waking up to feel a rat running across your chest or face. The sensation of whiskers brushing against skin, the scratching of claws, the weight of a rat walking across you. It's a specific kind of violation that made sleep difficult even when soldiers were exhausted. Michael Herr's Dispatches describes base camp rats as being big as cats and completely unafraid. Soldiers would shine lights on them and the rats would just stare back before continuing whatever they were doing. Throwing things at them, yelling, nothing deterred them. They'd scatter temporarily and return minutes later. The rats carried diseases, leptospirosis, various bacterial infections, parasites. Contact with rats or their droppings could make soldiers sick. Units stationed in areas with heavy rat infestations showed higher rates of certain illnesses traced back to rodent-borne pathogens. Rats would contaminate water sources. Finding dead rats in water supplies meant that water was unusable. The decomposition products and bacteria from rat corpses made water dangerous to drink even with purification tablets. Some units had to abandon water points because rat contamination made them unreliable. The gnawing was constant. Rats have to gnaw continuously to keep their teeth from overgrowing. They'd gnaw on equipment, wooden structures, sandbags, anything. Electrical wiring was particularly attractive. Multiple incidents of equipment failures were traced to rats chewing through wires. Soldiers tried various methods to control rat populations. Poison worked temporarily, but created the problem of rats dying in inaccessible places and creating horrible smells. Traps caught some rats, but barely dented the population. Cats were brought in at some bases, but even the cats couldn't keep up with the rat numbers. Some units organized rat hunts with varying levels of seriousness. Soldiers would go out at night with flashlights and clubs, killing rats. It became a grim form of entertainment that also served a practical purpose. The body counts from these hunts could be impressive, dozens of rats killed in a single night, but the population always recovered. The psychological impact of living with rats was significant. Having your personal space constantly invaded by rodents, knowing they were walking on you while you slept, finding rat droppings in your gear and food, it wore soldiers down. The feeling that nothing was clean or safe, that even your sleeping area wasn't secure from pests, added to the general misery of jungle living. Vietnam had spiders that would make arachnophobes quit on the spot. Large, numerous, and seemingly everywhere, these spiders didn't just appear occasionally, they were a constant presence. The size was the first shock. Some species had leg spans of several inches. Walking through jungle vegetation meant regularly encountering orb weaver spiders with bodies the size of your thumb sitting in webs stretched across trails. The webs were strong enough to be felt when you walked into them. Sticky strands would stretch across your face and you'd realize you just walked through a spider's web with the spider somewhere on you. The immediate panic of walking through a spider web and not knowing where the spider ended up created moments of frantic brushing and checking. Was it in your hair? On your back? Down your shirt? The other soldiers in your unit would help check, but the feeling of something crawling on you would persist even after the spider was found and removed. Soldiers moving through dense vegetation would emerge covered in spiders, not just one or two, but dozens of small spiders that had been living in the plants. These tiny spiders would be all over uniforms, gear, exposed skin. The process of removing them all was time-consuming and unpleasant. Sleeping areas attracted spiders. Setting up in a new position meant checking overhead for webs and spiders before settling in. Missing a spider during the check meant potentially having it drop on you during the night. Some soldiers developed obsessive checking habits, inspecting their sleeping areas multiple times before feeling comfortable enough to rest. The venomous species added actual danger to the general unpleasantness. While most Vietnamese spiders weren't deadly to humans, their bites were painful and could cause significant local reactions. Swelling, pain, and inflammation from spider bites added to the medical burden on units already dealing with numerous other health issues. Tim O'Brien references the ritual of checking gear for spiders and other creatures in the things they carried. This wasn't paranoia, it was necessary procedure. Spiders would crawl into boots, packs, helmets, anywhere dark and enclosed. Putting on boots without checking could mean being bitten on the foot. Reaching into a pack without looking could mean grabbing a spider. The webs themselves became navigation hazards at night. Moving through jungle and darkness meant constantly walking through spider webs stretched between trees and vegetation. The sticky strands would cling to faces and weapons. In tactical situations requiring silence, the distraction of dealing with spider webs while trying to maintain noise discipline was frustrating. Some spiders were aggressive. Certain species would rear up in defensive postures when disturbed, displaying fangs. While they generally wouldn't attack without provocation, soldiers working in bunkers or confined spaces where spiders had taken up residence would sometimes have to deal with defensive spiders that stood their ground. Viet ants came in multiple varieties, each miserable in its own way. Fire ants, army ants, and various other species made certain areas nearly uninhabitable. Fire ants were the most consistently painful. These small reddish-brown ants would swarm when their colonies were disturbed. A soldier sitting might not realize he was on top of a fire ant nest until hundreds of ants were already on him. Then they'd bite simultaneously, as if responding to a signal. The bites felt like being stabbed with dozens of hot needles at once. The venom caused burning pain that persisted for hours. The bite sites would swell into itchy welts that lasted for days. Soldiers who disturbed large colonies could receive hundreds of bites, causing enough pain and swelling to temporarily incapacitate them. Suddenly dealing with ant bites while simultaneously under fire created impossible situations where soldiers had to choose between staying in cover and being eaten alive by ants, or moving and exposing themselves to enemy fire. The discipline required to stay motionless and silent while being swarmed by biting ants is difficult to imagine. Army ants presented different problems. These ants would move through areas in massive columns containing thousands or millions of individuals. When an army ant column moved through a position, everything in their path was attacked. Insects, small animals, and yes, any soldier who didn't get out of the way would be covered in biting ants. The army ant columns were visible, a dark stream of moving ants flowing across the ground. Soldiers who saw them coming would evacuate the area, but nighttime movements of army ants meant soldiers might not see them until ants were already climbing up their legs. Harold Moore's accounts from Ia Drang mention ants as one of many environmental challenges soldiers faced. While not emphasized in his narrative, the brief mentions of soldiers dealing with ant bites while engaged in combat operations illustrate how these minor inconveniences were constant background problems even during major battles. Some ant species would get into food stores. Opening a case of sea rations to find it completely infested with ants was common. Ants in sleeping areas meant being bitten repeatedly through the night. Some soldiers would wake up with dozens of ant bites on their legs, arms, and torso where ants had crawled under clothing and bitten them while they slept. The itching from multiple ant bites could persist for a week or more. Certain tree-dwelling ants would drop onto soldiers walking underneath. These ants would immediately begin biting, and being covered in biting ants while moving through jungle created yet another layer of misery on top of heat, humidity, and heavy equipment. The mosquitoes in Vietnam existed in numbers that are difficult to convey. Not dozens or hundreds, thousands of mosquitoes swarming at once, creating clouds of insects that covered every inch of exposed skin. The sound alone was maddening. The high-pitched collective whine of hundreds of mosquitoes around your head was a form of psychological torture. Even when repellent reduced the number that could land and bite, the constant buzzing prevented rest and made concentration difficult. As covered in previous videos, mosquitoes carried malaria, dengue fever, and Japanese encephalitis. But beyond the disease threat, the sheer numbers of mosquitoes made daily existence miserable. Activities like eating, sleeping, or basic hygiene became battles against insects that never stopped attacking. The military-issue repellent was deep-based and effective when first applied. However, the jungle environment defeated it quickly. Sweat would wash it off within an hour or two. Rain would eliminate it almost immediately. Constant reapplication was necessary, but often impractical during operations. The repellent itself was unpleasant. It smelled bad, felt oily, and would damage plastics and synthetic materials. Soldiers learned not to touch equipment with repellent on their hands because it would degrade rubber, plastic, and certain fabrics. The choice became enduring mosquito bites or covering yourself in chemicals that destroyed your gear. Night operations meant dealing with mosquitoes in darkness. The insects would find any exposed skin, faces, necks, hands, any gap in clothing. Soldiers on night ambush or listening post duty had to remain motionless and silent while mosquitoes landed on them freely. Slapping at mosquitoes would create noise that could compromise the position. The welts from mosquito bites would cover soldiers' skin. Arms, legs, face, neck, anywhere mosquitoes could reach would be covered in itchy welts. Some soldiers developed allergic reactions to the sheer volume of bites, with excessive swelling and inflammation that required medical attention. Scratching the bites created infection risks. The combination of dirty fingernails, contaminated environment, and open wounds from scratching led to secondary infections. These infections could become serious, turning simple mosquito bites into medical issues requiring antibiotics or evacuation. Mosquito netting was issued, but not always practical. Setting up netting required time and space that weren't always available. During rapid movements or in tactical situations, netting stayed packed away while soldiers endured mosquito attacks. Even in more permanent positions, properly sealing netting to prevent mosquitoes from entering was difficult. The psychological wear from constant mosquito harassment contributed to the overall exhaustion and stress soldiers experienced. Never being able to relax without fighting off insects, never getting quality rest because of mosquito attacks through the night. This constant low-level torment added up over months of exposure. If there's one creature that appears in absolutely every Vietnam memoir, it's leeches. These blood-sucking parasites made every water crossing, every movement through wet vegetation, every patrol during monsoon season a guarantee that you'd be covered in them. Vietnam had both aquatic leeches in rivers and streams and land leeches in jungle vegetation. The land leeches were particularly disturbing because they could attack in areas soldiers thought were safe from aquatic parasites. The leeches would attach to any exposed skin, but they didn't stop there. They'd crawl under clothing, into boots, into any opening they could find. Soldiers would discover leeches in their armpits, groin area, inside their mouths if they'd drunk from streams, even in their rectums after sitting on ground where leeches were present. Karl Marlantes' Matterhorn includes detailed descriptions of leech removal rituals. Units would stop periodically during patrols for leech checks, where soldiers would examine each other, finding and removing the parasites. The leeches would gorge themselves on blood, swelling to many times their original size. A small leech the size of a pencil lead would expand to the size of a finger after feeding. The sight of an engorged leech attached to your skin was viscerally repulsive in a way that's hard to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. Removing leeches required care. Pulling them off could leave the mouth parts embedded, causing infections. The standard methods were burning them off with cigarettes, applying salt, or using insect repellent to make them release. Each method had problems. Burns from cigarettes, carrying salt specifically for leech removal, using up precious insect repellent. The wounds left by leeches would bleed more than seemed reasonable for their size. Leeches inject an anticoagulant when feeding, preventing blood from clotting. After removing a leech, the bite site would continue bleeding for an extended period. Soldiers would have blood running down their skin from multiple leech bites, soaking into their clothing. The anticoagulant also meant wounds from other sources wouldn't clot properly if leeches had been feeding recently. The combination of leech bites and other injuries created increased bleeding that could be dangerous in combat situations. The psychological impact of leeches was significant. Vietnam's scorpions weren't the largest in the world, but they were common, and their stings were seriously painful. These arachnids would hide in dark spaces during the day and become active at night, exactly when soldiers were trying to sleep. The scorpions averaged 2 to 4 inches in length, with the Asian forest scorpion being among the most commonly encountered species. Their venom wasn't typically lethal to healthy adults, but the sting caused intense pain, swelling, and sometimes systemic symptoms like nausea and muscle spasms. Soldiers would find scorpions in boots, clothing, sleeping bags, packs, anywhere dark and enclosed. The morning ritual of shaking out boots before putting them on was partly about scorpions. Missing a scorpion in your boot and putting your foot in meant getting stung on the foot or ankle, which would swell significantly and make walking painful for days. One soldier's account describes being stung by a scorpion that had crawled into his sleeping bag during the night. He woke to intense pain in his leg and the realization something was in the bag with him. The panicked thrashing to get out of the sleeping bag and find the scorpion in darkness was traumatic beyond the actual sting itself. The pain from scorpion stings was described as burning and electrical simultaneously, like being shocked and burned at the same time. The affected area would swell, become hot to the touch, and throb with pain for hours. Some soldiers described the pain as worse than being shot, though obviously the consequences were different. Scorpions would occasionally fall from overhead positions onto sleeping soldiers. Setting up sleeping areas under trees or in bunkers meant checking above for scorpions that might drop during the night. Despite checking, soldiers would sometimes wake to scorpions on them, or worse, already stinging them. Medical treatment for scorpions was mostly supportive, pain management and monitoring for serious reactions. Some individuals had more severe reactions, including respiratory difficulty, excessive sweating, and muscle spasms. These cases required evacuation and monitoring, taking up medical resources. Centipedes could exceed 12 inches in length, a foot of segmented arthropod with venomous claws on every segment and a painful bite. These weren't the small centipedes found in temperate climates. These were substantial creatures that looked prehistoric and delivered painful venomous bites. As mentioned in previous videos, the venom caused extreme pain. Medical personnel consistently reported that soldiers who'd been bitten by centipedes were in more immediate distress than many combat injuries. The pain was described as excruciating, comparable to or worse than broken bones. The centipedes were aggressive when disturbed. Unlike many creatures that would flee from humans, centipedes would often advance toward perceived threats. Their many legs allowed them to move quickly, and their aggressive defensive behavior meant soldiers couldn't just scare them away. Like scorpions, centipedes would hide in gear and equipment. A large centipede coiled in a boot or at the bottom of a pack would defend itself when disturbed. Reaching into a pack and encountering a centipede by touch before sight led to panicked reactions and often bites. The bites caused massive swelling. A centipede bite on a hand could cause the entire hand and forearm to swell. The swelling was often accompanied by discoloration. The tissue would turn red, purple, or black around the bite site. The combination of swelling and pain made using the affected limb difficult. Infections from centipede bites were common. The environment plus the mechanical trauma of the bite created ideal conditions for bacteria. Some bites became seriously infected, developing abscesses that required lancing at extended antibiotic treatment. For soldiers with bee or wasp allergies, hornet attacks were potentially fatal. Allergic reactions to multiple stings could cause anaphylaxis, airway swelling, difficulty breathing, cardiovascular collapse. These medical emergencies required immediate intervention with epinephrine and evacuation. Some operations were completely disrupted by hornet encounters. A documented incident describes a company-sized element conducting a sweep that encountered multiple hornet nests in the same area. The resulting chaos, with soldiers being stung, trying to escape, and dealing with injured personnel, effectively ended the operation for that day. The swelling from multiple stings made wearing helmets and gear difficult. Faces would swell so severely that eyes would be nearly swollen shut. This created additional problems beyond just pain. Soldiers couldn't see properly, couldn't wear their equipment, and were effectively combat ineffective until the swelling reduced. Base camps, bunkers, and anywhere soldiers slept for extended periods became infested with bedbugs. These parasitic insects fed on sleeping soldiers at night, leaving itchy bites and making restful sleep impossible. The bedbugs would hide in sleeping areas during the day, in cracks in wooden structures, in sandbags, in bedding material. At night, they'd emerge to feed. Soldiers would wake up with numerous bites in clusters or lines where bedbugs had fed methodically. The bites were intensely itchy. Some soldiers developed allergic reactions to bedbug bites, with excessive swelling and inflammation. The constant itching prevented sleep and led to scratching that caused secondary infections. Bedbugs were nearly impossible to eliminate completely. Spraying insecticides would kill some, but eggs and hidden bugs would survive. The population would recover quickly. Some positions became so infested that soldiers would rather sleep outside exposed to other dangers than deal with the bedbugs inside bunkers. The psychological impact of bedbugs added to the general sense that nowhere was safe or clean. Knowing that insects were feeding on you while you slept, that you'd wake up covered in bites, that there was nothing you could do to prevent it, this wore soldiers down mentally. The combination of bedbugs with all the other insects, parasites, and creatures created an environment where soldiers were constantly under biological assault. There was no reprieve, no clean place, no opportunity to escape from creatures that wanted to bite, sting, or feed on you. Enemy fire was terrifying but intermittent. These creatures were constant. Every day meant waking up covered in insect bites. Every patrol meant being swarmed by mosquitoes and leeches. Every night meant rats crawling on you and bedbugs feeding. Every piece of gear had to be checked for scorpions, centipedes, and spiders. The misery never stopped. Understanding these biological torments explains why Vietnam veterans talk about the jungle itself being hostile. It wasn't metaphorical. The environment was literally attacking them constantly through creatures that bit, stung, and parasitized them without mercy. If you're a veteran, you already know all of this. Thanks for your service. For everyone else, hit that like button, check out our other Vietnam content, and subscribe for more documented history. Drop a comment with your worst creature encounter if you've got one to share. Thank you for watching.